Tonight, we are going to discuss the updated estimates from the Pro Farmer Tour with Jerry Gidel right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. So Jerry, we have updated updates from the Pro Farmer Tour, and we have adjusted numbers with higher yields for several states. How do you see that?
Well, the interesting ones basically about higher yields are only in Indiana and Ohio versus are close to the USDA's numbers on both of those out there. In the Eastern Corn Belt has been the area that has had more chances for rain and maybe not some of the intense heats that we had back in late May and June. From there, in Illinois, they actually kind of did the similar situation here where they, I thought it was pretty generous on some of their numbers, but, they were up 1 or 2 bushels from the USDA. But boy, west of the Mississippi, particularly Minnesota and Iowa, the last two states that they kind of put together here, came in with some interesting data here. The USDA was 203. Their actual average for the whole state that and they do some sampling in all 9 of the districts out there in Iowa from the standpoint of the tour. They don't do a lot of it in the South Central area of the because basically that part of the state south of Des Moines is not as many acres or as productive. But that all being said, their average at 181 bushels, even if you adjust it for the fact that the yields have seasonally in the past been somewhere from between 5 and 6 bushels higher, they still took their number from 203 in the government down to 197. 6 bushels is a pretty good adjustment there in Iowa. Nebraska, a similar situation there. The conditions out there when they were going through was really the top of the heat dome that was out in the Western Corn Belt at the time, and their estimate 175 versus the USDA's August number of 183 is quite. That's another significant 8 bushels less. From there, in the Minnesota number. From there, and interestingly enough, is that the area that they survey out there in Minnesota is really the heart, the 3 bottom districts of Minnesota where you really have your best yields, and traditionally then the areas, and basically the corn production areas then up the western side of Minnesota up to North Dakota. As you remember, the North Dakota's wheat yields this year were hurt because of dryness, so I don't expect a lot of real strong yields up there on the northern or the west central and the northwest districts of Minnesota. And so the traditionally, at least, that's even happens normally. And this year, I think it's even going to be stronger. Nebraska, definitely a scenario where they had conditions out there that hurt their dry land pretty significantly. The irrigated land looked pretty good, but they were pretty cautious about expecting only a 173 versus a 184 yield for the Nebraska output, because Nebraska surprisingly is the third largest producing state. Minnesota's in there too. Those two flip back and forth. Of course, Iowa's number 1, Illinois number 2 in corn production, and then Indiana traditionally comes in number 5. Sometimes South Dakota comes in there, but I don't think that'll be the case this year. But that's the interesting kind of twist here, that some of these Western states in their average scenario were at least cautiously projected at this time. Now, utilizing these states, which are really the guts of the Midwest here in the U.S. corn, the 7 states that they go through. Missouri is a little bit in there, of course, but Wisconsin, Michigan. But in reality, the impacts of those states are going to be there. And I think that's part of the reason why they were a little cautious about their national estimate, 172 point bushels versus the 175 the USDA has. Now, the one thing that's also been kind of bouncing around here in the industry in the corn estimates is will there be some adjustments in the planting and harvesting numbers for corn and soybeans here this year? Traditionally, we've had some issues where some of the corn plantings weren't really tidied up by the first part of June, and that prompted some delayed reportings to the USDA's farm agency offices around the U.S. And so there's been kind of they say you want to say a natural relationship of the numbers that are first issues in August to maybe the October numbers, that they tend to go up in harvest or planted and harvested acres. I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I am not in the big camp that this year's August numbers weren't as inclusive as they've been in previous years. I think they were because of the fact that we really had a lot of the planning accomplished by the 1st of June. There really wasn't any particular area of the country that wasn't able to get their corn in. Maybe a little bit in North Dakota that didn't get in. In the 1st of June, or excuse me, the 1st of May, but it was in there quickly by the 1st of June. And I really sense that might be some cautiousness in that maybe not going to happen, that we're not going to have as the adjustments maybe upward in planted. We already got 5.5 million more acres here this year. I don't know that there's going to be another 600,000 that was projected by ProFarmer, but it's in there. But overall, interestingly enough, that particular set of numbers does start to make things interesting here when we look at the supply-demand numbers that we're looking at this point. Because if you're talking about taking 3 bushels off with 80, with a 85, 87 million harvested, that's 360 million bushels that might not be in the bin. That's going to potentially take this USDA's September number, if it's completely there. And I don't know if the USDA is going to go that far down to 172, but even if they move down from the 175, that's going to be a factor here to maybe pull us down closer to under 2 billion. Now, the biggest problem is that we're still at 190, 2 billion on the corn. So soybeans are going to be a real highlight going forward here, though, because of the data that we found this from the ProFarmer tour that occurred here last week.
Now, going over the Friday's close for the Mercantile Exchange, we had a pretty significant rally for soybeans. What's the aspect that you see behind that?
Well, I think there was some anticipation of maybe some of these numbers, which officially weren't released until after the close on Friday. From there, to some extent, on an ongoing basis here, each night there was a place that you could kind of listen to what the 2 main people who were involved in the ProFarmer tour, to get this much information and get it done in a timely manner. You basically have to have 2 sets of crews here. You got people that start in Columbus, Ohio, and they move through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Eastern Iowa, and then ultimately their final stop is in Rochester, Minnesota. A similar set of people start out in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, go to two spots in Nebraska, one in Grand Island and one in Nebraska City, which is just south of Omaha. And then they move up the western side of Iowa, stopping in Spencer, and then they end up in Rochester too. And I think their commentary towards the end of the week was pretty interesting here from the point of view that are interestingly enough, this year's pod counts were up from last year's pod counts, but they were very concerned about the number of seeds that they saw within these pods. Traditionally, 3 and 4 seeds per pod. Occasionally, you find 1 or 2 on a plant that might have 5, but they don't want to see 2 seed pods, and that's a big difference in what your yield's going to be. A lot of commentary coming off from people as they were counting these things, and that made them cautious. And then the heat, of course, in August is interesting because you can sometimes a plant to basically produce the seeds on the plant. If they feel like they have too many pods, they'll shed some of those pods if it's too dry. And so all of a sudden there was a lot of fear that, I'm counting these things, but I'm not sure how many of them are going to make it from there. And particularly in the western areas, parts of Nebraska, western Iowa, and even Minnesota, surprise, surprise, the fields were already starting to show some yellow leaves. And that's very early to start. When you start to see that situation happen in your bean field, you're not that's not what you want to see. Even in Eastern Corn Belt, maybe you want to start in some places there in the early part of September, but even in Iowa and Minnesota, you'd rather not see any of that kind of stuff turning, the leaves turning on your soybeans until mid to late September, because that means you're putting more weight onto the fields, things like that. That's just it's the natural mechanism that plants show that they are moving towards harvesting, and they're not really adding more bushels to your yields. Beans, it's a yellowing of the fields. In corn, it's a similar situation. It kind of goes from dark green to light green to kind of pale white out there. You see it a lot in summertime when you see these lower leaves on plants that are drying up, as they basically are trying to shed some of their mechanisms on the corn plant for but I'd have to say that there wasn't as much of the dry foliage on corn, particularly east of the Mississippi, that we've had in some years. So that's somewhat positive on there, and I guess that's the reason why the yields that they're projecting here, with a record level in corn, Indiana, very high in Illinois and Indiana, yields as part of that on the corn. But beans, wow, they ended up coming up with a 1.2 bushel lower yield. That doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking about 80 million, you're talking about a chance for maybe 90 to 100 million less. And if you remember last month, they were projecting a 245 million carryover. So all of a sudden that number could go all the way down to 150. I probably don't think that'll happen in the month of September, but it's potentially indicating that this soybean carryover stock in the U.S. could be quite tight if that's the case. Now, I know that there's always the possibility that that South America is going to have another bonus year. On Brazil, I'm not so sure about that. Of course, I expect some kind of recovery going on in Argentina after their tough year that they had. But the interesting twist right now is that the Argentine traders and are getting quite concerned about the fact that the wheat crop, I should say, down there it's the time of year here. In essence, they're going into their spring period while we're going to the fall here in the U.S., and they're still very dry, and they're getting concerned that the wheat crop is going to be hurt again, like it was last year, and at the same time, could be an indication that some of the corn plantings they traditionally do might be delayed or even reduced. Now, there's two planting seasons in Argentina. There's a section that happens October, early November, and then they wait and do another set portion of it that's after they finish up their beans and that soybean plantings, and that starts in late December, January, and that. But unfortunately, this last year, that particular corn, they had a very tough year, and they only came up with about 35 million. I think there's still a lot of question marks about Argentina's corn crop. The bean crop really got hammered last year, somewhere between 21 and 24 million metric tons. But the USDA is not that low, but we'll see where that turns out to be. But right now, at least the data that came from our friends at Pro Farmer here last week, I think was quite interesting and actually somewhat eye-opening here. Now, I have to say that some people might have felt that they had maybe pushed a little harder on some of their national yields, 172 versus 175 on corn, and taken the U.S. yield down 1.2 bushels from the USDA and that. But I'd have to say that they are at least trying to point out that there is definite risk out here in the month of August here. And the interesting part of it is that it's based a little bit on our forecast. We did end up cooling off a little bit here in the eastern U.S. after being a scorcher and that, but they're talking about warming up, and there really isn't a lot of rain in the thing. That's the other part of it. You stress something, you need to get that rain in there to compensate for it. Okay, we reduced the temperatures, but we didn't get the plant some compensating moisture when it cooled off, and now all of a sudden, it just continues to be less and less moisture for them to add more bushels out here for both corn and soybeans. So we'll have to see how the world respects it, but I got to think that beans are still going to find some footing here, and I think the corn even is going to end up basing out here and trying to get a better feel on what our yields for 2023 are going to be.
Now, another spotlight was the completion of grain exports from Ukraine out of the grain deal.
Oh yeah, that's been a constant battle out there for the Ukrainians trying to come up with alternatives, and that the Eastern European EU members, the Poles, the Hungarians, other ones out there, are still very, very cautious about and trying to indicate that they do not want any kind of bushels coming into their country. That they're trying to promote, and even the EU is talking about how to promote transshipments and more dollars for that type of thing. The most accommodating country in the whole Eastern European world is Romania. They're really in the process of trying to help get some of those shipments that used to go through Odessa to come down and be able to go out off of the Danube. Now, the problem a little bit is that I'm not sure that the Russians have no desire to let the Ukrainians get get this whole system set up, and then they've been kind of bombing basically some of the port facilities on the Ukrainian side of the Romanian border, which is also one of the various tributaries off of the Danube, and that. So we'll see how much gets done there as to and the reality of them getting more capabilities for exports. But that's definitely another feature in this thing, and I kind of feel like that if they can get this. Unfortunately, you have to transport it by rail all the way down into Romania. Somehow or other, if the Russians are shooting missiles at the ports that are along the Danube or in Odessa or whatever, why aren't they going to shoot at trains? And if you knock out a train route, it can be down a long time, just like it can for a port facility. So I don't know. Right now, at least, one of Putin's, I guess you'd have to call irritant, all of a sudden got his plane shut down. So I'm not sure that means that the Ukrainians are going to have free sailing to get more exports out of there. So that's another issue as we go forward in this whole thing. But one thing is that the Russians aren't really winning on the battlefield. They're trying to make sure they win on the economic field, and we'll see if that happens.
All right. We'll talk again next week. Thank you very much.
You bet. You bet. I'm glad you're feeling better too. You're looking better, this kind of stuff. So we're going to, next week's going to be an interesting one going into a first week in September here as we stare into the U.S. harvest that will be beginning in mid to late September. So have a good weekend, and we will talk next week.